Hare Om Namaha. The majority of disciples, adherents, and even casual followers of Prabhupada's branch of Lord Chaitanya's Hare Krishna line believe with no lack of evidence that things have not gone well in the GBC since he left the scene in late 1977. There must be reasons for that, and we shall focus on them and their root causes. As most of you know, Prabhupada created what he called a governing body commission for his movement in 1970. What led to that creation is a long story. There is no need for the purpose of this podcast to get into that creation history. There is a need, however, to discuss just how that commission played out in terms of its misdeeds in particular. Did that GBC manage his institution in the way he desired and ordered it to do, even while he was present? If so, to what degree? Did it manage his institution the way he desired, expected, and ordered it to do after he departed? Or did that commission and its leading men have another mentality? A takeover mentality, very soon after he left. Consider this excerpt from a letter to one of Prabhupada's leading secretaries dated October 8th, 1974. Quote, "Now by the grace of Krishna, we have got sufficient properties all over the world. So there cannot be any diplomacy or conspiracy by any sane man. All these properties and opulences, whatever we have got, this will not go with me when I go away from this world. It will remain here. I am training some of my experienced disciples how to manage after my departure. So, if instead of taking the training, if in my lifetime you people say, I am Lord of all I survey, that is dangerous conspiracy." Unquote. In 1972, 1 year after a major setback, Prabhupada had this to say about his health in general and his heart condition in particular. Quote, "I am an old man. I came here at the age of 70 years. Now I am 76. So my warning is already there. In 1971, I had a severe heart attack. You know all. So the mission of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is now in your hands." That was from an arrival lecture at Los Angeles, dated May 18th, 1972. In whose hands? Obviously, it could only mean, at the very least mostly mean, in the hands of that governing body commission. This was verified during a room conversation dated November 5th, 1977. Quote, "The institution depends on the GBC." Unquote. Please note, that statement was made less than a fortnight before he left physical manifestation. Besides the obvious fact that a spiritual master could not possibly himself manage an international institution with thousands of initiated disciples, here are two other excerpts from Prabhupada's many letters. These quotes verify that his movement's standard for being maintained was up to the GBC. In a letter to a leading secretary dated September 13th, 1970, quote, "I have invested the GBC for maintaining the standard of our Krishna Consciousness Society, so keep the GBC very vigilant." Unquote. in a letter to one of his first initiates, dated July 9th, 1971, quote, GBC members are simply to see that things are going on. Other centers have got president, secretary, etc., and they are managing separately. That is the formula. So how is it that the GBC are the final authority? They are simply to examine that things are going on nicely. That's all, unquote. As most of you know, in all of our presentations, we liberally quote Prabhupada directly, more often than not via excerpts from his letters. A text without context is a pretext. In other words, we offer these excerpts always in the context of the theme being presented. In this month's presentation, we're going to be focusing on and commenting upon many such letters, more than usual. If you don't appreciate that, it is not our problem. It's a you problem. Let us begin in chronological order. In a letter to a Bombay president dated August 12, 1971, quote, GBC does not mean to control a center. GBC means to see that the activities of a center go on nicely. I do not know why Tamal is exercising his absolute authority. That is not the business of GBC. The president, treasurer, and secretary are responsible for managing the center. GBC is to see that things are going on nicely, but not to exert absolute authority. That is not in the power of GBC, unquote. This excerpt indicates that control of the GBC in terms of direct management was limited. This commission was primarily meant to supervise. Keeping the movement bona fide was its duty, but the GBC had to stay in its lane in terms of direct management. Only the presidents directly managed the centers. The GBC advised them. It was an overseer via each commissioner in his particular zone. The commission was never all-powerful. If it did not stay in its lane, it could, as a deviated entity, wreak havoc, which is exactly what it did. In a letter to a leading secretary dated August 14th, 1971, quote, sometimes there are complaints against the GBC, which is not very favorable. I set up the GBC with hope that I shall get relief from administration of the mission. But on the contrary, I have become the center of receiving so many complaints, so it is not a relief for me, unquote. Prabhupada wanted to concentrate on his translations and purports. The GBC, if it acted according to its directive from Prabhupada, was meant to facilitate the devotees in general and the presidents in particular. It would oversee the mission in judging and advising the bhakti processes being implemented at the centers. The GBC was meant to help resolve difficult situations and complaints that the presidents were unable to rectify. Herein we find evidence that it was not meeting the standard very well, even in the early days, and that would only get worse. In a letter to a leading secretary dated August 20th, 1971, quote, then collect the opinions of each and every GBC member, and if the majority supports the idea, then it should be taken as a fact for being carried out in our society. The majority vote, in my opinion, should be taken. When the majority opinion is present, my opinion will be yes or no. In most cases, it will be yes, unless it is grievously against our principles, unquote. Why would Prabhupada specifically write to a GBC man that he would approve most of the Commission's resolutions unless he found one or some of them, quote, grievously against our principles, unquote? If the GBC men composed an advanced body, which would mean that they were all advanced in spiritual life, then how could the commish ever pass a resolution that was not just against the principles Prabhupada gave his disciples, but grievously against them? We shall see tangible and strong evidence of the answer to this question in forthcoming excerpts, which by this time will not shock you. After all, we have over 40 decades of its actions to go by now. A lot of what has come down the pike from the governing body proves the answer. In a letter to a leading secretary dated September 1st, 1971, quote, "People have respect for our movement. Now it is time for GBC members to be very, very careful so that people may not point out any black spot in the behavior of our society," unquote. Beginning in the late 70s, there would be many blemishes on the fabric of his movement created by the GBC. However, in the early 70s, no one thought such would be the case. Please note, up to 1972, Prabhupada's letters to the commish were almost entirely favorable. It had engaged in an important and successful service to his cause immediately after its creation, and we have discussed that previously. Sure, there were some negative comments about it by him, and we have produced those. We've produced them to jog your memory. But it was not until 1972 that something went down which was really shocking. Indeed, some call it a conspiracy. Whatever your conclusion about that 1972 incident may be, which is going to be presented subsequently, certainly what went down in the spring of 1978, a mere 6 years after the incident we are about to tackle now, qualifies as certainly having a conspiracy underlying it. In a letter to a leading secretary dated April 2nd, 1972, quote, "I have just now received one letter which has described your GBC meeting of 9 men in New York, and I have cabled Rupanuga the following message, quote, GBC meeting irregular. My strong disapproval. Make no changes. Inform others. Letter follows," unquote. So you can understand that I am very much perplexed why you have done these things without consulting me in the matter. If every time someone feels something, they call for changing everything, then all that I have done will very quickly be lost. So for the time being, there shall be no such changes as you have arranged until I study the matter thoroughly, unquote. Notice the warning, quote, "All that I have done will very quickly be lost," unquote. In a letter to another leading secretary dated April 4th, 1972, quote, "But if you all, my right-hand men, are doing things without consulting me and making such big changes within our society without getting my opinion and the opinion of all the GBC members, then what can I do? I am so much perplexed why you have done this. I have appointed originally 12 GBC members, and I have given them 12 zones for their administration and management, but simply by agreement, you have changed everything. So what is this? I don't know. You mentioned that you are taking great help from Atreya Rishi, but Atreya Rishi is not a member of the GBC, nor has he any position in my scheme to manage the whole society," unquote. Big change is conducive to big deviation. That has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt at this time, but was first indicated in this long excerpt that I've just read. That meeting in New York was not an example of commish supervision. It was all about making a significant change to how the movement was to be run. Prabhupada certainly needed to be consulted about any such initiative, but he was not. Also, 4 other GBC men were neither informed of the meeting nor invited to attend it. The proposal was a big change with negative ramifications and repercussions. The fact that neither Prabhupada nor those 4 other commissioners were either informed or invited to this ad hoc meeting is strongly indicative of a conspiracy by those 7 GBC men and the extra participant, who almost certainly was Atreya Rishi. The following is a telegram, a cable, to 2 GBC men and all ISKCON presidents, dated April 7th, 1972. Quote, "Your material legal formula will not help us. Only our spiritual life can help us. Hangsaduta must return Germany immediately and don't leave again. Atreya Rishi has no authority from me to manage anything. Remove him. I have no approval for any of these plans. Don't change anything." Bhaktivedanta Swami. This was a telegram shot off by Prabhupada from Sydney, Australia, to 2 of his leading secretaries specifically, both of whom were members of that unauthorized ad hoc meeting. Prabhupada directly calls their proposal a, quote, unquote, material formula. This means that it had no spiritual sequence. Prabhupada pins the tail on the donkey. He knew the chief ringleaders of the conspiracy. Prabhupada orders Atreya to be removed from the concocted managerial scheme or any management position. Prabhupada closes with the order, quote, "Don't change anything," unquote. A very hard-hitting telegram. And please note, Prabhupada almost never communicated with any of his leaders via either telegram or telephone. So time was of the essence with him sending a cable. Also, the telegram is there in the historical record. And certainly that's helpful. The following is a letter to all ISKCON presidents dated April 8th, 1972. Quote, "Atreya Rishidas was selected to be secretary for GBC and receive all correspondence, including monthly reports. I never appointed Atreya Rishi a member of the GBC, and I do not know how he can be appointed secretary to GBC without my sanction. He was also appointed to be on the management committee with Kurandar for the purpose of supervising ISKCON business and implementing the decisions reached by GBC. This has very much disturbed me," unquote. And further, quote, "Sriman Atreya Rishi may be very expert, but without my say, he has been given so much power, and this has upset my brain. I also understand that immediate actions are going to be taking place even prior to my permission, and that also, quote, without divulging to the devotees," unquote. There was an exclamation point put after that, by the way. I do not follow exactly what is the motive of the so-called GBC meeting. Therefore, I have sent the telegram, which you will find attached herewith, and I have received the replies as well. Under these circumstances, the following is all in capital letters, I authorize you to disregard, for the time being, any decision from the GBC men until my further instruction, unquote. On April 8th, 1972, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada suspended and disempowered the governing body commission of ISKCON. It does not really matter for how long of a time it was gutted. What matters is that it clearly had its power and legitimacy taken away from it, and deservedly so. Supervisory power was given back to the temple presidents, and this was clearly stated later in that letter. The conspiratorial meeting very much disturbed him, as unequivocally made clear. Prabhupada comes down hard on Atreya near the letter's beginning, and rightfully so. Hansaduta had brought him to the meeting, but the scheme was actually Atreya's. It was to centralize all the collections from all centers into a fund that he would manage and invest in order to create further profit, but only if those investments panned out. The scheme also entailed centralizing all of the centers in a given zone into a central place. This was acted upon by the commissioner of the U.S. Central Zone. Your host speaker was one of the devotees affected by that at the time. However, I had no knowledge of the scheme or how the closing of the well-run Madison, Wisconsin Center was actually unauthorized. The actions according to the plan were to be implemented even previously to informing Prabhupada of it. The plan was not to be divulged to any of the rest of the devotees who were not involved in formulating it. That penchant for secrecy, which Prabhupada pointed out in the above-mentioned excerpt, continued for many years after this particular unauthorized effort. The letter, which was sent to all temple presidents worldwide, culminates in all caps, emphasizing that the GBC has been suspended and that all orders received from it were to be disregarded. This letter proved, beyond doubt, that the GBC was never endowed with infallible judgment or absolute unquestioned power. It proved then, and still proves now, that the GBC is capable of taking action that is against the principles of its own charter, as well as Prabhupada's desire and vision. Then, please note, a mere 6 years after this 1972 deviation, it would once again proceed with but another unauthorized plan. That later deviation, the zonal imposition, would eventually turn out to be a death blow for the movement. That it was a movement killer is now beyond question by all sane and serious devotees of the Guru Parampara. Tattvamasi. The following is a letter to one of the conspirators of that ad hoc meeting, dated April 11th, 1972. Quote, "The meeting of the GBC appeared to be very unconstitutional because all the men were not informed or invited. Shyamasunder was not invited. Sudama was not invited. Krishna Das was not invited. Tamal Krishna was not invited. Neither I was informed. Why? You cannot hold meeting of 8 persons without inviting the others. 7 may be a quorum, that's all right, but you cannot convene without a general announcement to all the members and myself, giving a proposed agenda like that, the topics to be discussed, why the meeting is being called, etc." Unquote. The ad hoc centralization scheme was both conspiratorial and unconstitutional. That all commissioners should, at bare minimum, have been notified of it and invited to attend it is common sense and basic. 4 were not. One of those, of course, was the commissioner traveling with Prabhupada, because he also was not notified of it. As such, although the technicality of 7 commissioners constituting a quorum was met, that was meaningless when there was no notification to the others. Most importantly, Prabhupada was not informed of the proposal, which he would have nipped in the bud if presented its agenda. That alone made it conspiratorial beyond any doubt. Here's another excerpt from that same letter of April 11th, 1972, quote, "I cannot understand why, instead of one GBC man, a person outside the commission was given so much power, and there was to be immediate action without divulging the matter to the devotees. And I am surprised that none of the GBC members detected the defects in the procedure. It was detected only when it came to me. What will happen when I am not here? Shall everything be spoiled by GBC?" Unquote. The vaunted, quote-unquote, best man argument falls flat on its face via this important excerpt. Also, the argument that the group will automatically correct the error of any individual proposal or resolution or any individual powerful member, that argument is toppled. Because there were 8 of those men present, and not one of them was able to spot the defects in the procedure. Now, of course, with Prabhupada saying it that way, that's the benign interpretation, so to speak. He sort of lets them off the hook in that way. But we shall not do so in this presentation. Again, the penchant for secrecy is challenged by Prabhupada. Still, it never went away, as evidenced by everything that was hidden in connection to the appointment that never was 6 years later. What was just being referred to here is in 1978. All that banter, disguising a secret, that Prabhupada actually appointed 11 Diksha Gurus, although he never did. He only appointed Ritviks. The fact that he never did was hidden. It was kept a secret. It took until the second half of 1980 for it to be finally discovered that he never appointed or officially recognized any of his disciples to be Diksha Guru. Back to the 1972 excerpt. It closes with an ominous warning. Quote, "What will happen when I am not here? Shall everything be spoiled by GBC?" Unquote. Unless you are a, air quotes, ISKCON fanatic or crazy, you all know the answer to this question by now. Everything was spoiled. And it was spoiled a mere 4 months after he departed physical manifestation. Notice also that in asking this, what turned out to be a rhetorical question, Prabhupada chose to use the verb shall. Your host speaker does not consider that to be accidental. How is shall generally used in contemporary English? It is generally used in legal locution, meaning that, quote, "this or that shall come to pass, or shall be resolved, or shall be known as the intent of this proposal," unquote. In other words, you could say that in 1972, Prabhupada was giving all of us a warning shot of what was coming down the pike in due course of time a mere 6 years later. However, that would not be entirely accurate, because the temple presidents did not share this letter with the rank and file devotees. The excerpt and all the others connected to it allow us now, in retrospect, to put the pieces of the puzzle together at this time. That could not have been done in 1972 because the letter was kept confidential from the devotees at large, the real workers, by not only the GBC but by the temple presidents. We all know now that Prabhupada gave the GBC another chance back there in 1972. The suspension was brief. The individual GBC members were chastened to some extent, obviously. As such, Prabhupada attempted to deal with them individually as favorably as could be expected. About 2 months after he smashed that centralization scheme, Prabhupada wrote a letter to one of the scheme's 2 chief ringleaders. Here's an excerpt from that letter. It was dated June 22nd, 1972. Now we have got so many students and so many temples, but I am fearful that if we expand too much in this way, we shall become weakened, and gradually the whole thing will be lost. Just like milk, we may thin it more and more with water for cheating the customer, but in the end, it will cease to any longer be milk. Unquote. This was prescient on Prabhupada's part, obviously, because that thinning of the milk is exactly what went down, or began to develop in a big way, less than a year and a half later, with all the deceptive practices connected to the plain clothes pick. The money increased, the movement increased in numbers, but the purity and power decreased dramatically. The milk kept getting thinned out by the water of constant deception. In due course, it filtered out from the external world, where the pick was in full swing, to inside the temples themselves. The big collectors were glorified. The quote-unquote Sankirtan newsletter measured monetary results as the standard for preaching advancement. A covert element of feminism also entered the movement. It had, up to that point, been kept at bay. It entered because the females out at the airports were invariably the biggest collectors every week, with few exceptions. They utilized the sexual energy intrinsic to the dry hump, and they brought in the biggest bucks. All the collectors were not only allowed to eat grains on Ekadashi, but encouraged to do so. Other concoctions for allegedly attracting Vikarmis to join the movement emerged from the ocean of nescience at that time. One of these was the road show. Another one was an incipient plan for a yoga village. All of this was in the immediate wake, actually in the same year, of the centralization conspiracy and Prabhupada's warning about boiling the milk, meaning not putting emphasis on numbers, but instead on purity. Here's what Prabhupada had to say about those 2 above-mentioned concoctions. In a letter to a leading secretary dated November 5th, 1972, quote, "So far the road show and this yoga village are concerned, these things should be stopped. Simply perform our kirtan. If we divert our attention in this way, the whole thing will gradually deteriorate. He is going far away. All these things are nonsense inventions. Such inventing spirit will ruin this movement," unquote. Inventions included the plain clothes pick, which Prabhupada was against before it even got off the ground. In effect, he forbade it. It was to be very limited. He allowed for devotees to dress nicely in respectable suits, but only with the shaved head, tilak, flag, and neck beads on display. In a letter to a leading secretary dated February 13th, 1973, quote, "The devotees can dress up in respectable clothes like ladies and gentlemen in order to distribute my literatures under special circumstances. But even this program should not become widespread," unquote. Does it get more clear than that? That was in early 1973. This order was overridden. The plainclothes pick, initiated in late 1973, exploded almost everywhere in America the following year. One of the 2 chief ringleaders of that 1972 centralization scheme was the main commissioner, who went ahead to implement the plainclothes pick anyway. And yes, he is the one who received the letter wherein Prabhupada ordered that it was not to be done. He also received an important letter at the end of 1972 from Prabhupada, reminding that man just how devastating the centralization scheme would have been if Prabhupada had not nipped it just in time. Here's an excerpt from a letter to the Commissioner of Southern California, dated December 22nd, 1972. Quote, "Each temple must remain independent and self-sufficient. That was my plan from the very beginning. Why you are thinking otherwise? Once before, you wanted to do something centralizing with your GBC meeting. And if I did not interfere, the whole thing would have been killed. Do not think in this way of big corporation, big credit, centralization. These are all nonsense proposals," unquote. Was the centralization scheme a conspiracy? Prabhupada indicated that it was 2 years after the fact. The quote has already been presented before in this presentation, but let's repeat that excerpt, dated October 4th, 1974, quote, "Now by the grace of Krishna, we have got sufficient properties all over the world, so there cannot be any diplomacy or conspiracy by any sane man. All these properties and opulences, whatever we have got, this will not go with me when I go away from this world. It will remain here. I am training some of my experienced disciples how to manage after my departure. So if instead of taking the training, if in my lifetime you people say, 'I am the Lord of all I survey,' that is dangerous conspiracy," unquote. The centralization scheme would have terminated the authenticity of the movement if Prabhupada had not interfered. He suspended the GBC as a result of it. It would have centralized finances and diminished the number of preaching centers. However, in and of itself, it would not have polluted the devotees in terms of their sadhana practices, their kirtan in the streets, or their basic duties or sevas. There were no changes in consideration of these essentials, none of any consequence, as a result of the aborted centralization. Yet, Prabhupada considered it very serious, didn't he? And as per the late 1972 excerpt I have just read, he said it would have killed his movement. How does that compare to what went down in the spring of 1978? The GBC zones were redrawn and replaced with guru zones. As such, the GBCs who were not gurus lost influence over the temple presidents, who naturally gravitated to the gurus. In point of fact, almost all of them surrendered to the guru of their zone. The only holdout was in Raman Reti, India, but hardly anyone knew of it. The temple worship was negatively impacted, as those new gurus were lavishly worshipped on opulent, quote-unquote, vyasasans in front of open deities. In some temples, their worship replaced the Guru Puj of Prabhupada. They were also worshipped by their own god brothers and god sisters, what to speak of newcomers who naturally were enamored by them in the zonal temple that they happened to first visit. In 1978, the altars were desecrated with pictures of Sahajias next to the real Acharyas, who had been on those altars from the very beginning. As could only be expected, the articles used out in the field to collect on the pick degenerated quickly and badly. Books and magazines gradually, make that not so gradually, were replaced by records, candles, scarves, candy canes, and various trinkets in order to pick the bone and bring it on home. In summary, the mode of passion took over the movement. Comparatively speaking, the centralization scheme of 1972 was a firecracker compared to a bomb that went off throughout the movement a mere 6 years later. The rank and file never knew that Prabhupada said, regular guru, that's all. The, air quotes, ISKCON gurus did not act at all like regular gurus or Madhyamadikaris. Instead, they all imitated Uttamadikari, in effect imitating the founder Acharya. Now ask yourself this question. Would Prabhupada have merely suspended the GBC for allowing all of that to go down? They said that they were appointed by Prabhupada. This was a major prevarication, because although Prabhupada indicated that he would name some gurus in early 1977, he never did. He changed his mind. He had every right to do so, because no one was qualified to be guru, even at the preliminary level. However, in the lead up to and implementation of the Acharyas of the Zone hoax, the appointment of Ritviks in mid-1977 was merged into the illusion of an appointment of 11 gurus. Everybody bought into this because that was the propaganda everywhere in the movement. It was intentional. It was disgusting. It was an abomination. And it most definitely was a conspiracy. And, unfortunately, it was successful, and it was a successful conspiracy that remained implicitly accepted worldwide for a full 2 years. In that time frame, the quote-unquote new gurus loaded almost all the temples and preaching centers with their own improperly initiated disciples. Referring to the zonal imposition just short of a decade later, Professor Bluebud commented on it in this way, quote, "And the worst of this was committed by men Prabhupada entrusted with responsible positions. Internal weaknesses and shortcomings turned the 11 years of Prabhupada's personal supervision into a concatenation of crises," unquote. Most definitely that was the case. Now, from the overall perspective, remain confident that the absolute truth never varies. But institutions allegedly representing it can deviate. They can deviate sometimes in their teachings, but more often in their processes. Philosophical pursuit of the absolute truth entails contemplating and understanding what is to be known from the tattva and siddhanta given through the Guru Parampara. This pursuit is not in the category of philosophical dogma. However, when genuine institutions deviate from what their founder Acharya presented to them, that deviation and its implementation in the cult does constitute both philosophical and procedural dogma. These anomalies have been constantly occurring, none of them by accident, since the disappearance from manifest physical presence of His Divine Grace in late 1977. These anomalies have run rampant and expanded since that time. That Pandora's box of deviation was lifted up a bit while he was still physically present. However, it popped wide open in the last week of March 1978. That onslaught of contamination has led to the creation of hierarchies, both in the movement he founded as well as in the splinter groups which have spun off from it. All of these cults and their subcults falsely advertise that they can connect you to the absolute truth via initiation into them, but this is nothing more than an advertisement with no basis of legitimacy. None of this went down by accident. It was planned, although those plans did not work out well for the conspirators in the long run. Krishna consciousness came into contact with the lower modes of the Western world, and glaring anomalies, although avoidable, were nevertheless the predictable result. Totalitarian systems concocted from anomalies were the result, as each of the deviant groups and their subgroups claimed to represent the absolute truth, but none of them do. This results in a kind of imitation Sanatana Dharma. And the worst offender in this connection is, of course, the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. It was its governing body that opened Pandora's box in the late 70s. It did so by institutionalizing 11 contaminated leaders as being pure devotees on the highest level of Krishna conscious realization. They were all considered to be acharyas. The institution's governing body, with all 11 of those men part of it, bestowed upon them exclusive zones throughout the world. Each became domains and playgrounds from which they drew, through facilities provided mostly by metropolitan centers, newcomers. Virtually none of these new people had anything even remotely resembling knowledge of Krishna consciousness when they entered the temples in those zones. There are basics in Krishna consciousness. There is basic tattva and siddhanta. The tattva and siddhanta of what is a guru in the personalist school is required before anyone should submit to accept some kind of initiation from anybody. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. There is a basic process in bhakti, and that process can be warped. The guru in that process, when he is genuine, meets required standards and is not in deviation from bhakti in any way. When the process is warped, however, the gurus representing it will be perverted reflections of acharyas. This was the case in the late spring of 1978 in so-called ISKCON. Nothing that those zonal acharyas concocted was sanctioned by the founder acharya of the institution, but he was no longer physically present to stop them. You have every right to call it a conspiracy. You have every right to consider that it has killed Prabhupada's branch of Lord Chaitanya's Hare Krishna movement. You also have every right to leave it and not fall for the allurement of all that constant banter about reform. You also have every right to pitch in and help to expose it, if you are brave enough, realized enough, and powerful enough to do so. Sareva Samya